The sun dipped low over the jagged horizon, casting long shadows across the barren plains. Dust swirled in the dry wind, whipping against the weathered fences of a lone ranch that had stood too long against time and neglect. The air was sharp, carrying the scent of sagebrush and scorched earth. A single rider moved slowly across the land, his coat torn, boots caked with the dust of 1,000 miles. His face was a map of loss, lines carved by grief, eyes hardened by solitude. He had lived here for years, though lived was a generous term. The rancher had abandoned the town, the laughter, the life that once pulsed through his veins. He spoke little to no one, and when he did, it was clipped, careful, a guard against the world that had taken everything from him. The wind sang through the empty barn, its timbers creaking like the whispered memories of a life that could have been. Evening descended, and the coyotes began their haunting chorus. The rancher's gaze swept the horizon, searching, measuring, always alert. There was a rhythm to his days: tend the herd, repair the fence, draw water from the dry well, and sit by the fire long into the night. But tonight something shifted, a ripple of movement far beyond the edges of his land. Shapes on horseback, shadows riding against the dying light. The rancher's hand instinctively went to the grip of the revolver at his hip. His pulse quickened. Strangers rarely came this far, and yet these figures rode with purpose, steady, patient. 10 of them. Apache. Memories, sharp and uninvited, stabbed at his mind. He had seen the world betray him in countless forms. Fires that devoured homes, friends who had turned into foes, letters that spoke only of loss. He had buried his family in his heart and built walls around himself thick enough to stop even the gentlest kindness. And now, these 10 riders approached, eyes wary but hopeful, carrying nothing but what they could hold and a need he could feel even from afar. The rancher dismounted, boots crunching on the parched soil. The air between them was tense, charged. The Apache leaders made no grand gestures, no proclamations. They simply stopped, letting the wind and the silence speak. One of the riders, a boy no older than 10, clutched a small bundle to his chest, his gaze flitting nervously between the rancher and the empty plains beyond. Hours passed like this, stillness stretching, the land holding its breath. The rancher studied them, worn clothes, faces etched with stories, eyes that held a mixture of fear, hope, and exhaustion. He could see the cuts on their hands, the dust in their hair, the hunger in their eyes. And somewhere, deep within the walls he had built around his heart, something stirred, a recognition of shared solitude, a mirror of his own brokenness. Night fell, and the first stars pierced the indigo sky. The rancher moved first, crossing the stretch of dirt that separated them. He led them to the barn, where the air smelled of hay and old leather. He made no promises. He offered no smiles. He simply opened a space, a fragile gesture that could either heal or shatter. They accepted without words. One by one, they dismounted, shaking off the dust, brushing past the silent sentinel who had chosen to witness their arrival. They stacked what little belongings they carried and shared the warmth of the fire he built, flames licking at the cold night, illuminating faces that had weathered storms both literal and invisible. The rancher moved among them, distributing blankets and water, offering the simple necessities of survival. He did not speak much, but each gesture held weight, a careful choreography of caution and humanity. The youngest Apache, emboldened by the firelight, pressed closer, their small hand brushing against his coat. A flicker of something, perhaps remembrance, perhaps hope, crossed his eyes, gone as quickly as it appeared. Outside, the wind howled through the broken fence posts. The stars moved slowly across the sky, indifferent and eternal. Inside the barn, the crackling fire held them in a fragile orbit of warmth, a temporary reprieve from the loneliness that had defined his existence. Memories came unbidden. He saw his family again in the flames, faces blurred, voices lost, laughter extinguished. He remembered the night the world had turned on him, when the town burned and promises failed, when he had been forced to leave everything behind. And yet, in the quiet presence of these 10 strangers, He felt something that had been missing for years. Connection. Tentative. Fragile. Unspoken. Morning arrived, not with fanfare, but with the soft, relentless light of the sun spilling over the plains. The Apache began to help with chores, tending to the herd, mending fences and clearing paths. They moved silently, efficiently, a rhythm that spoke of resilience and survival learned from the land itself. The rancher watched them, his mind shifting in ways it hadn't in years. He saw a trust beginning to form in small, almost imperceptible gestures, a shared glance, a hand offered, a nod of understanding. And though he did not say the words, though he did not soften fully, something had shifted. The solitude that had defined him, that had been his shield, now felt porous. These strangers, these 10 Apache souls, had arrived not just seeking shelter, but bringing with them a spark, an ember in the vast darkness he had carried alone by the time the sun reached its zenith. The ranch was alive with motion. The herd grazing cautiously, the Apache moving with quiet purpose. The rancher standing on the porch, hands on his hips, eyes scanning the horizon. He felt a tremor of anticipation, a flicker of the life he thought had been extinguished forever. He did not know what tomorrow would bring. He did not know if the world would betray them again, or if the bond forming in the firelight would survive the harsh realities beyond his fence. But in this moment, he was no longer entirely alone. And that, in itself, was a beginning, a fragile, unsteady, and utterly human beginning. The wind carried their voices across the plains, soft murmurs of planning, of laughter, of the quiet acknowledgement that even in the most desolate corners of the world, life could return, reshaped and new. And as he watched the shadows stretch and the sun climb higher, the rancher allowed himself the tiniest, almost imperceptible sigh. Perhaps survival was not enough. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was room once more for hope. The next morning, the air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet earth after a rare overnight rain. The plains glistened with droplets, each blade of grass a tiny mirror reflecting the pale light. The rancher walked among the herd, his boots sinking slightly into the softened soil, the leather of his coat damp at the collar. He moved deliberately, aware of every sound, every shift in the wind. The Apache were awake before him, their quiet movements threading seamlessly into the rhythm of the ranch. They worked without words, carrying out tasks with a precision born of necessity. Some mended fences, others prepared food, and a few led the animals to water. The youngest children lingered close to the fire pit, peering curiously at the rancher as he inspected the corral. Their eyes, wide with both caution and wonder, mirrored something he had almost forgotten. Innocence by midday, clouds had gathered above, dark and heavy, rolling across the sky in sheets of gray. The wind picked up, whistling through the gaps in the barn and rattling loose boards. The rancher felt it in his bones, a warning. He had faced storms before, sudden and merciless, but this one felt different, as if the land itself were testing him. He glanced toward the Apache, who were already moving to secure the animals. They had adapted quickly, their presence no longer a tentative guest ship, but a living part of the ranch. One of the elders, a tall man with a scar tracing his jaw, nodded at the rancher. The gesture was simple but profound. Trust, earned silently through action rather than words, had begun to root itself in the air between them. The storm struck with sudden fury. Rain fell in sheets, mingling with wind that bent the trees and whipped the tall grass in a frenzied motion. Lightning tore across the sky, and thunder rolled, shaking the earth itself. The herd panicked, bellowing and running against the fences. The rancher moved quickly, opening gates, guiding the frightened animals into the barn. The Apache followed suit, their calm movements counterbalancing the chaos. Inside the barn, water seeped through the roof, dripping onto hay and soaking the earth beneath. The rancher and the Apache worked without speaking, hands moving in tandem, eyes meeting only briefly to communicate unspoken understanding. Every soaked sleeve, every strained muscle was a wordless conversation. every gesture a testament to the bond forming under the pressure of survival. When the worst of the storm passed, the rancher stepped outside, letting the rain wash his face. The Apache children laughed, chasing puddles, their voices bright and unrestrained against the gray aftermath. He watched them, a lump forming in his throat. He had seen laughter before, long ago, but it had belonged to a world that no longer existed. And yet here it was, fragile and defiant, reminding him that life could still find its way through even the deepest wounds. As evening descended, the rancher returned to the barn, his hands raw from hours of labor. One of the Apache elders approached, carrying a bundle wrapped in cloth. Without a word, he handed it to the rancher. Inside were simple supplies, dried meat, a few coins, and a small notebook. The gesture spoke volumes, an offer of help, yes, but also a bridge between worlds, an invitation to let the past and present meet. Night fell, and the wind settled into a mournful whisper. The ranchers sat by the fire, the Apache gathered around, their faces glowing in the flickering light. He could see their stories etched into every line, every scar, every tired smile. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the air, carrying with them the unspoken promise that they were all, in some way, survivors. He thought of the letters he had never sent, the photographs he had buried, the memories he had tried to lock away. And he realized that the presence of these strangers had begun to crack the walls he had built. They did not demand his story, nor did they judge him for it. They simply existed alongside him, resilient, patient, and steadied. At a small fire burned in the corner of the barn, and the youngest Apache child approached, holding a rough sketch. The paper trembled in small hands, but the drawing was clear. A rancher standing among animals, shadows of people surrounding him. The rancher looked at the sketch, and for the first time in years, he felt a warmth that was not born from the fire. He nodded slightly, and the child smiled, retreating to join the others. Sleep came fitfully that night, the rancher lying awake as the wind moaned outside. Memories of betrayal, loss, and solitude pressed against him like the storm outside. Yet beneath it all, a flicker of hope remained, a fragile ember that refused to be extinguished. The Apache slept nearby, their quiet breathing a rhythm that anchored him to the present. Morning arrived, softer than the night, with sunlight breaking through the dissipating clouds. The rancher rose, his body aching, but his spirit lighter. He watched as the Apache prepared for the day, their movements a blend of strength and grace. He realized that he was no longer merely a solitary figure on the plains. He was part of a larger tapestry now, woven together by shared struggle, silent understanding, and the slow, steady pulse of trust. The days that followed were a dance between survival and connection. Storms came and went, predators lurked at the edges of the land, and the rancher's past remained a quiet shadow. Yet each moment of cooperation, each act of kindness, built something stronger than mere survival. It was a fragile, silent promise that even the harshest landscapes, even the loneliest hearts, life could find a way to endure. And so the rancher moved among the Apache, teaching and learning, guarding and sharing, silently acknowledging that his life, once a landscape of grief and isolation, was beginning to bloom again. It was not a return to the world he had lost, nor a denial of the pain he carried. It was something subtler, quieter, and infinitely more powerful. The slow reclamation of his humanity, one gesture, one shared task, and one small, precious connection at a time. The dawn broke slowly over the plains, the sky streaked with orange and pale violet. A quiet tension hung in the air, heavier than a morning fog. The rancher stood at the edge of the property, eyes scanning the horizon. The Apache had been awake for hours, moving with quiet purpose, their faces focused and alert. Something had shifted overnight, a subtle sense of foreboding, a ripple of danger that neither he nor the elders could ignore. The herd grazed cautiously, sensing the unease that clung to the wind. Birds scattered from the trees, startled by an unseen presence. The rancher's hand rested on the worn handle of his revolver, not in anticipation of confrontation, but as a reminder that survival was never guaranteed. Life had taught him that lesson too many times. By midday, the threat became unmistakable. A small group of men, rough and armed, appeared over the rise of a distant hill. Their eyes were hard, their faces lined with greed and suspicion. Word had traveled across the plains. There were newcomers at the ranch, and some had decided they wanted the land for themselves. The rancher's chest tightened. He had faced hostility before, and he knew that words alone would not deter them. The Apache moved with him, silent and deliberate. Each gesture, each glance, was a plan without spoken commands. The rancher realized that this moment was more than a test of strength. It was a test of trust, of the bonds that had formed quietly in the shadows of hardship. The first clash was sudden. Dust exploded as hooves struck the earth, a swirl of motion and chaos. Guns fired, echoing across the plains. The rancher ducked behind a fence post, feeling the sting of dirt and splintered wood against his skin. The Apache moved like shadows, precise and fearless, protecting the young and guiding the animals to safer ground. Amid the chaos, the rancher saw the faces of the attackers. Hardened men who had no patience for kindness, no memory of loss, no capacity for understanding. But he also saw the faces of the Apache, calm in the storm, eyes steady, movements purposeful. And in that instant, he understood the meaning of the trust that had grown in silence. Hours passed like this, a blur of dust, shouts, and the relentless sun beating down. By late afternoon, the attackers had retreated, some wounded, others defeated, leaving the ranch scarred but intact. The rancher stood in the center of the chaos, breathing heavily, the weight of exhaustion pressing on his shoulders. Around him, the Apache tended to their own, helping the injured, checking the animals, rebuilding fences torn in the battle. It was then, in the quiet aftermath, that the true test emerged. A small child, the youngest of the group, had wandered toward the edge of the property, drawn by curiosity, oblivious to danger. The rancher's instincts flared, and he sprinted forward, scooping the child into his arms just as a wounded horse stumbled nearby. For a heartbeat, the world paused. Wind cutting across the plains, sun glinting off dust, silence heavy with meaning. He held the child close, feeling the warmth of life and the fragility of it all. Tears streaked his dirt-smeared face, and he realized that the walls he had built around his heart had finally come down. Not through words, not through grand gestures, but through the quiet, persistent presence of those who had trusted him, and whom he had come to trust in return. Evening fell, painting the sky in deep reds and purples. The rancher and the Apache gathered around the fire, tending to wounds, sharing small comforts, and reflecting in silence. The youngest child drew another sketch, this time of the rancher and the Apache standing together, the storm behind them, and the plains stretching endlessly forward. The image was simple, yet it held a profound truth. Survival was no longer solitary, and hope, once a flicker, was now steady. But the night also brought loss. One of the elders, a quiet figure who had guided them with wisdom, did not rise from the barn. The rancher felt the weight of grief pressing down, sharp and unrelenting. He knelt beside the man, closing his eyes in respect, feeling the finality of life and the importance of memory. Not all battles ended with victory. Not all hearts survived the storm and the quiet hours. The rancher wandered the property, touching the fences, the barn, the ground, and the wind that carried whispers of the past. He thought of those he had lost, of mistakes he could not undo, of lives he could not save. And yet he also thought of those who remained, of the fragile bonds that had formed, and of a life rebuilt from ashes. Dawn arrived again, soft and golden, and the rancher stood on the porch, looking out over the plains. The herd grazed peacefully. The Apache moved through the land with purpose, and the sky stretched infinitely above them. He felt the weight of scars and survival, the quiet satisfaction of trust earned and shared, and the undeniable truth that even in a world of loss and hardship, life resilient and persistent, could still flourish. He lifted a hand to the horizon, a silent vow to the land, to the people who had come into his life, and to the memory of those he had loved and lost. This was not an ending, nor a beginning, but a continuation, a fragile, enduring testament to the power of connection, courage, and resilience. And as the wind whispered across the plains, carrying the voices of life and memory, he felt it. The ember of hope, steady and bright, burning in the heart of a man who had learned that even the loneliest soul could find a family, even in the most desolate place. If this story touched you, if you've ever carried a wound the world couldn't see, leave a comment below. Let your story be heard. And remember, even in the darkest valley, a single ember can light the way.